Extraordinary meridians, the misunderstood meridians. That is going to be the topic of this episode of Chi Life. Okay, so overall I think understanding of the extraordinary meridians is improving over time. I'm sure if you go back anciently there was a much better understanding of them, but in more recent times it seems like we've gone through a period of a lot of people really not understanding the extraordinary meridians. Going back a few decades ago, I recall when I was doing a lot of research into Qigong and aspects of traditional Chinese medicine, it was often really hard to find good sources of information about the extraordinary meridians. And as part of that, looking at different things that people had written, well, it was clear to me, certainly seemed to me, that people were writing from a perspective of like, yeah, just not really understanding them, but like kind of having a stab at it, And so I'd see things about like, oh, the extraordinary meridians, they're extraordinary because they're so mysterious and so people don't understand them. It's like, oh, okay, so that's clearly you don't understand them, but that doesn't mean everyone doesn't understand them just because you don't. Or another one's like, the extraordinary meridians, they're the spiritual meridians. And again, I think this is because like, why are we calling it spiritual? Because we don't understand them. So they'll say it's kind of deep or, something a little bit beyond understanding. And so I guess in this vlog, I'll talk a little bit about the extraordinary meridians and part of why I think they have been misunderstood. Again, I think overall a better understanding is sort of starting to grow again of the extraordinary meridians as I look around now compared to a couple of decades or so ago. I do see a lot more good information easily found about the extraordinary meridians, and so that's great. I guess for a start, just the name Extraordinary Meridians. Now, of course, this is a translation from Chinese into English, and so there's different parts to it in terms of Chinese. I think in Chinese it's kind of like strange as part of like the extraordinary, that sometimes can be translated as strange, and talking about these strange pathways of energy, flows of energy. If we just look at the English word though, there can be a tendency, so extraordinary, sometimes people are like extraordinary because they're so great, but if you look at the very literal definition of extraordinary, it's made up of two parts: extra and ordinary. Now, extra can mean more, but also extra often sometimes just means like different from, outside of. Extra, like what's an example of that? Nothing's coming to mind right now, but extra sometimes just means outside of, ordinary, right? So the ordinary meridians are the organ meridians. That's what is considered the ordinary meridians, the ones that relate to the function of our internal organs and a whole lot of other functions in our body as well, our posture, our emotions, and so on. And so the extraordinary meridians are the ones that are not the ordinary meridians. They're outside of the ordinary meridians. Pretty straightforward, eh? Doesn't need to get into mysterious and spiritual and super and all that sort of thing to understand what that means. Now, why the misunderstanding then? And I think a lot of this is because the very nature of these extraordinary meridians is quite different from the ordinary meridians or the organ meridians. And it makes them hard to depict and describe in the same way as the organ meridians, the extraordinary meridians have been, but often that's what people have tried to do, and that then leads to the misunderstanding. So for the organ meridians, the ordinary meridians, these function very much like rivers. It's just such a great analogy. I have made other vlogs referring to this analogy. I'll put some links to those below. I think there's at least a couple, so I'll put some of those below to go more into that in terms of how the organ meridians are very much like rivers. beautiful analogy, ties in really well, and it's one of these principles where we see patterns in nature and we see them reflected down in different scales. We see that same pattern within ourselves. Now, a river generally has a very defined path. Sometimes that path can change, and that's really interesting about the ordinary meridians too, that sometimes it can change. They're not necessarily always in the same place, just like a river can change. Most of the time it doesn't, but it can be diverted out of its path. Same with the organ meridians. Also, relatively speaking, if you look in a landscape as a whole, a river is a narrow, clearly defined path. And so there are these very narrow, clearly defined paths that the energy flows through in the body, the organ meridians. And so when people are depicting these, describing them, they will draw them as a line on a page, and it's a narrow, defined line, and it does a pretty, and they'll often mark specific points, important points on that line where the energy can be accessed and redirected and so on. These are known as acupuncture points. And it's a pretty accurate depiction. It can't capture all of the detail, of course, but it's like, yeah, it is pretty narrow defined. It shows it pretty well. So they then try to do the same thing with the extraordinary meridians. And they're like, oh, here's a line. This is where the extraordinary meridian is. Except the whole structure of the extraordinary meridians is so different from the organ meridians. The extraordinary meridians are much more like ocean currents, big, broad swathes of movement of the stored energy within our body. So much so that another name or way of describing the extraordinary meridians is not as meridians, but as vessels. A store of energy, a vessel, something that contains it. And this is referring to, again, the nature of these, that they're not just these narrow, thin pathways, they're big vessels of stored energy. They're big currents of our stored energy. So if you look at, the breadth, the strength of an ocean current compared to a river, a river can be strong to a certain extent, but compare that to an ocean current. An ocean current is massive and wide. Look at it in the context of a landscape. It's a big, broad flow of energy. Also, the amount of energy that flows through an ocean current, or amount of water flowing in an ocean current compared to a river. Yeah, even a big river, compare the amount of water moving compared to an ocean current. And I think this is part of what leads to the mysterious or spiritual or, like amazing meridians. It's like, yeah, you're moving a lot of energy. It's not that they're like super spectacular in a like otherworldly way. It's just, it's a different phase of the movement of energy. Narrow, specific flow within the rivers, the organ meridians, or this big, broad flow of our stored energy within the ocean currents. And parts of some of the implications. So I think this part of how those extraordinary meridians is a big part of what is misunderstood and why they're misunderstood. Because so many people try to treat them as if they were, the same as the organ meridians, but it's like they're not really, and so they don't work in the same way. So they're mysterious, don't understand them. And some parts of this are well known though, but I think maybe the link isn't understood. So one of the things that most people, if they have some understanding of the meridian system, not most people who've never heard of meridians before, but most people are aware of, is that the extraordinary meridians, apart from the central and governing meridian, so the central or conception one, which comes up from under the pelvis, up the front of the body, up to here, underneath the lip, and coming up the back of the body, up the spine, over the head, to here on the upper lip. These ones have their own acupuncture points, really important points coming up those meridians, but none of the others, and there's 8 extraordinary meridians, so 2 have their own acupuncture points. The other 6 don't have their own acupuncture points at all. In terms of points, all they have is some key points on the ordinary meridians, the organ meridians, which they cross over. You're like, you can use this point and this has an effect on them. Why do they not have their specific points? Because they're so big and wide. How do you pick a point? To like, now, points can have an influence in them, but they don't. It's like it's this big, broad, wide flow of energy. It's like, difficult in terms of like, where would the point even be? And so because of this, in terms of how to work with extraordinary meridians, yes, you can use points sometimes, and points particularly on the central and governing, these are right on the center line of the body. They can be really, really powerful, of course. But most commonly, the way we work with the extraordinary meridians is working with the whole flow through that meridian, through that vessel, through that pathway, that whole ocean current. And they respond much better to this rather than narrowing in, tiny little point, like, okay, whole big flow. Let's get that whole thing flowing. Let's, whatever needs to happen to it. So hopefully this has been insightful for some people. Again, like I said, this sort of understanding is starting to be more common. Not super common yet though. I think some of those misunderstandings are still quite prevalent out there. Hopefully this will help direct a few people to a better understanding of the extraordinary meridians. They are quite normal. It's just a different phase of our energy movement. They are quite powerful to work with. Lots of good things come out of working with them. In terms of the long white cloud Qigong practices, of course, a number of different practices work with these extraordinary meridians. One that works with them very directly is a practice, just a helicopter going past, hopefully it's not too loud. It's a practice called Between Heaven and Earth, which focuses very directly on the 8 extraordinary meridians. And then as part of that, that opens up a whole lot of things, sending energy into our energy field, strengthening our connection to heaven and earth to build up our energy. A whole lot of good things come from that. So I think I'll find a link to a video of that practice as well. If you're interested in that, put a link to that below if you might like to have a look at it. Or of course you can look on the longwhitecloudqigong.com website. There's obviously lots of good resources there. All right, hopefully that's been interesting. I look forward to seeing you on another one soon.